Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon for those of you in Europe, and good morning or evening to the rest of you. I'd like to welcome you all to this IISS webinar on climate change, prospects for a green recovery, presented by the Institute's Conflict, Security, and Development Program. I'm Jeff Mazo, Associate Fellow for Environmental Security and Geopolitics at IISS. With me, we have four distinguished panelists today. Sir Andy Haynes, Professor of Environmental Change and Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Helen Clarkson, CEO of the Climate Group, an international nonprofit working with businesses and governments with a mission to promote climate action. Dr. Louisa Dressler, economist in the Tax Policy and Statistics Division of the OECD's Center for Tax Policy and Administration, and Brian O'Callaghan, lead researcher and project manager of the Oxford University Economic Recovery Project. I think it's fair to say that time is running out to address the climate crisis. The initial emissions reduction targets for 2030 under the Paris Agreement were only 1/5 to 1/3 of what was needed to keep warming to relatively safe levels. And before the COVID pandemic, we were not even on track to meet those wholly inadequate targets. Without urgent action, the world's on track for potentially disastrous temperature rise of more than 3 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. On the other hand, more and more major emitters are setting aspirational goals of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, or in the case of China, 2060. The crucial question is how exactly we get there from where we are now. In Strategic Survey 2020, our annual assessment of geopolitics published last November, the IISS called 2020 a year of reckoning postponed. By this, we meant two things: the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of around 7 to 8% due to COVID's economic impact offered a short-term breathing space for enhancing climate ambition. But the disruption and distraction caused by COVID also postponed some urgent decisions and meetings, especially the COP26 summit in Glasgow and the submission of new national climate targets for the next decade. Nevertheless, it was clear early on that economic rescue and recovery measures on a scale greater than those of the 2007-8 global financial crisis will be needed, and that this offers opportunities to accelerate the transition to a low or net zero carbon economy. So far, these opportunities have been, for the most part, neglected in favor of immediate rescue packages and a desire for a rapid recovery. The broad questions then that we want to address in this webinar are: what might or should such a green recovery look like in terms of investments, fiscal mechanisms, and structural changes? How does the pandemic make this current crisis and opportunity different from previous economic crises such as 2007-8? Which sectors, for example, public health and transportation, have been most badly affected by the pandemic, and can they contribute to or inhibit a green recovery in unique ways? And finally, what are the barriers, political, institutional, and cultural, to achieving a green recovery, and how might these barriers be overcome? Well, these questions are very broad, very comprehensive, and I'm not sure how much depth we'll be able to get to on each one, but I'll hand over now to our panelists to each address the questions, or some of them, from their own unique perspectives and expertise. So, Professor Haynes, I'll call on you first.
Thanks very much, Jeff, for the introduction. So what I want to do really is to sort of set the stage from a point of view. I think it's clear that public health is in the political frame really more prominently than it's been for many, many years, decades, as a result of the COVID pandemic. COVID, of course, has had impacts on health directly through the deaths due to COVID and the long COVID, the symptoms that persist, but also because it's damaged the care of many non-COVID conditions as well. So in many countries, we're seeing large backlogs of treatments for other conditions, cancer and so on, other chronic diseases. So it's had really very far-reaching implications for healthcare, public health, and of course for the economy itself. All of these are intertwined. So how can we emerge from the COVID situation on a much more sustainable trajectory that will support public health as well as accelerating progress towards the Paris Climate Agreement? Well, I want to make the argument that many of the policies and strategies that we need to put in place as we emerge from COVID can support public health directly and indirectly, and at the same time also support climate action, ambitious climate action. It's important to recognize that air pollution, for example, much of it from the burning of fossil fuels, contributes to several million premature deaths a year, and indeed may increase the risk of COVID. There is quite a lot of circumstantial evidence that long-term exposure to air pollution also increases the harms, the risks of adverse outcomes from COVID. So in emerging from COVID, it makes a lot of sense to invest in technologies, policies, strategies, interventions that can help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, thus reducing the threat to health from climate change, but also produce near-term benefits from the reduction of air pollution, from more sustainable transport systems founded increasingly on public transport. As we get the vaccines rolling out, we shall be able to use public transport more. Or active travel in cities, walking and cycling, which bring many health benefits from physical activity, as well as reduced air pollution. And sustainable food systems and diets, because we also know that poor dietary intake, poor nutrition is such a major driver of ill health. And we have dysfunctional food systems, which result in about 800 million or so people suffering from undernutrition, where over a couple of billion are overweight or obese. So there's much that we can do within existing systems to reform and transform those to create a healthy, low carbon or zero carbon future as we emerge from COVID. The two challenges then are to create more resilient health systems, more resilient societies that are able to cope with shocks much more effectively. And that means investing in public health, investing in vaccines through programs like COVAX, for example, which will enable a much more equitable sharing of vaccines, but also to strengthen the basis of the health system, primary care, which is such important contribution to responding to COVID and many of these other challenges that I've outlined. And finally, I think we need to also think about healthy employment. We know that investing in zero carbon, in decarbonization, will create many more jobs per $1 million. About the estimates I've seen are about 3 times more jobs per $1 million invested than investment in fossil fuel industries. So making the argument for investment in these public goods, vaccines, the healthcare systems, but also in rapid decarbonization, I think we can put improvement of public health and the safeguarding of public health very much at the forefront. And we have a unique political opportunity to do that because public health is very much at the forefront of the political agenda, as I've said, for the reasons that we're all aware of. So we are in a difficult situation, but with the vaccine and with these insights that many of the policies we need to put in place can help to improve health and stabilize health, not just through investing in the health sector, but through policies across a range of different sectors. I think we can really have a very positive message to communicate to decision makers, and health professionals are increasingly doing that. You may have seen that 40 million, the representatives of 40 million health professionals wrote a letter to the heads of the G7 last year, urging a rapid trajectory towards zero carbon healthy economy. So we are beginning to step up. I'm very happy to answer questions in the Q&A, but I'll hand over now to my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andy. Helen, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. So just start to introduce myself. The Climate Group's a non-profit organisation working internationally, and our goal is to get to a world of net zero carbon emissions by 2050 with greater prosperity for all. So our mission is about driving climate action fast, and we work with businesses and governments around the world, bringing them together, setting ambitious commitments and using that to shift markets and policies. So talking about the green recovery is very central to what we're up to. And a lot of businesses we work with, the governments we work with state and regional governments are thinking very, very hard about this. And it's a funny time, I think, to be working on the climate because, you know, I keep saying I've never felt the climate tailwinds to be so strong. And someone last year said, you know, there's no silver lining in COVID, but there is a golden opportunity. And I think it's about thinking about that. So I was looking, the most recent figures I've seen are that the government's economic stimulus plans around the world, if you add them together, come to about $14.9 trillion. It's the biggest injection of cash into our global economies that we will ever see, I think, in our lifetimes. And I think what's different about this crisis is, you know, if you look back to 08, 09, those of us who were working on sustainability then with businesses were being told, you know, leave us alone for a bit, we'll come back to you later, we need to get back to business as usual. But what's really shifted in the 10 plus years we've had since then is really different sort of bits of the economy moving. So businesses have grasped the agenda much better than they had back at that time. We saw that 4 years ago when the US said that it was going to drop out of the Paris Agreement, and actually businesses went to the federal government and said, don't do this, we need to be in Paris. And that's hugely different from where that had been before. We had the 1.5 degrees C report that came out in 2019, which really shocked everyone on how much the difference is between 1.59 and 2 degrees C of warming. And then, of course, we've had the Greta Thunberg effect, and just school children around the world putting pressure on, saying to their parents, what are you up to? That's had a real ripple effect. I think all of this has come together. So we've got better understanding of the environment, better understanding of the science and the urgency. And at the same time, we've got governments who are going to need to pump money into their economies, who've agreed to that. Exactly at the same time that those same governments are being asked to up their commitments under the Paris Agreement. So all of that sort of swells together to say, yes, the green recovery looks more promising than if this had happened a few years ago. And we started to see this playing out in 2020, as early back in April, May, we started talking to the businesses we work with and say, well, is this going to affect your climate plans? And over 90% of them said, no, it's not going to. And in fact, it's going to make us more ambitious. And you saw the EU come out very quickly, start talking about green recovery. That phrase green recovery was getting traction. China made its net zero commitment. And then we've had the US election, which has fundamentally changed federal policy. So I think all of that is good. One thing we need to start to talk more about is not what's happening in 2050, but what's happening in 2021, 2022, and the rest of this decade. And I think the UK example, which you know, a lot of the audience will know about, this Cumbria coal mine shenanigans is probably the best word for it, I think has been a really good example of this, because you know, you've got on the one hand Cumbria saying, oh, well, we need coal to make steel, and their argument was, well, look, you know, yes, we need to be at net zero by 2050, but we've only given this a license to 2049, so that's fine, right? And of course, the UK Climate Change Committee saying, wait, we've actually got a roadmap for how we get to 2050, and we're out of coking steel by 2035. Cumbria have called this new information. I don't want to get into a big argument whether they should have known this and where everything went wrong, but I think it's really interesting this debate has played out about, look, it's not just about what is happening on the 1st of Jan 2050, but what is the road that gets us there. And that's where we start to get into this green recovery conversation, which is really about jobs, about the money that's being spent in our economy and how all these different aspects line up. So that's all about long-term planning. And when we talk about the climate decade, we say the 2020s need to be the climate decade. We need to halve emissions by 2030, but that's about decisions that we're taking right now and in the next couple of years that determine what our emissions are by the end of the decade. So that's sort of the framing for me of the thing. And in terms of, I know we want to get into some of the questions, and one of the things that you raised was like, is this going to happen? What's the likelihood? How much of a shift have we seen in the kind of social, cultural, economic forces? So as I said, we talked to our business members last year. 99% said that their company are going to be permanently altering their business practices as a result of COVID. So cutting overseas travel, questioning the real estate of their offices, rolling out more energy savings. I think it's really going to be interesting, this point about, is there also a social and cultural shift? I'd be interested to know what Professor Haynes thinks about that. Are we going to see a shift on how people talk about scientists, what people think? You know, is this going to help the public perception? Because it's been, you know, a lack of trust for the last few years. Vaccine take-up rates, I was thinking, well, they're higher than people predicted, but maybe we haven't got to the skeptical age group yet. So I think we're sort of working through that, but we do know that the public have shifted on the climate, and it'll be interesting to see how that continues to play out. So we're sort of seeing in the kind of green recovery level work that we're doing influencing government policy. So we've seen in places like Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan, our RE100 campaign, which is business commitments to renewable energy, being name checked in their stimulus packages. That's great to see. And that's what we work on, is bringing together these collective businesses to influence policy. So overall, I'd say, and this is at the end of my opening remarks, is, you know, this question, is it going to be successful? It's got a better chance than I would have given it 5 years ago. So I think, you know, we are in a better position. The tailwinds are there, but we've really got to keep pressing and keep up momentum, because it's not going to do it on its own.
So thank you, Erica, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this webinar, and such a timely topic. I think after having heard Helen making the case that we're in a better position to go towards the decarbonization from the business side and the society side, I'd like to go maybe more into detail into the policy instruments that are available to go towards decarbonization and how this links to recovery packages. And I think as a backdrop, let me just make a distinction between recovery packages and rescue packages. So I'd say that during the rescue phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, governments are implementing fiscal policy action, but this is more an immediate emergency response, not so much a stimulus phase, but more a rescue phase. And now if we go the step further to the recovery phase, where governments continue implementing extraordinary fiscal policy action, but here we go towards the stimulus packages. And here governments have an opportunity to green the recovery packages, of course, and to speed up the structural change towards the low carbon transition that Helen was talking about, and while recovering from the COVID crisis. And we have talked about all these commitments that government have taken during the Paris Agreement, which is to decarbonize our economies by the second half of the century. So Jeff, you asked what a green recovery should look like, and I think here I don't want to go too much into the expenditure and spending side, because if I understand well, Brian will go more into detail in that later. But take a step back and look at the tax, or the other side, the tax policy side. Because what I want to underline is that we need to acknowledge that it is not realistic for all stimulus money to go directly to green projects. There are trade-offs between environmental goals, economic goals, social goals, etc. And there's also the question whether countries have enough fiscal space to provide extensive stimulus. So what I want to underline here is that the role of tax policy, and in particular carbon pricing, is important, and carbon pricing should go hand in hand with stimulus packages or green recovery packages. And this is to create a strong enabling environment to go towards the low carbon transition, to go to decarbonization during the recovery, but also beyond. And this is for at least 3 reasons, I'd say. First, carbon pricing reinforces green stimulus. If we continue to not price carbon emissions, or if we continue to price them below their costs to society, then green stimulus measures will be much less effective. Second, carbon pricing aligns traditional stimulus with climate objectives. So even if the stimulus is not explicitly targeted towards decarbonization. Why is that so? Carbon pricing raises the cost of carbon intensive assets, and it will steer the investment decision, the consumption choices towards the cheaper, the low carbon alternative. So if there's stimulus without a green conditionality, still carbon pricing helps direct investors towards the low carbon choices. And then third, carbon pricing can also help to restore public finances, at least in the short to medium term. It augments tax revenues. And so my main point here is that we should think of well-designed carbon pricing to act as a complement to recovery packages. And of course, it may be difficult to increase carbon prices now at the height of the crisis. And therefore, what is essential is for countries to commit to raising carbon price paths, so to price trajectories, and to put them in place now. So in a sense, that means providing support through green recovery measures, but connect the support to strong prices in the future. And of course, these carbon price trajectories also gives a lot of certainty to investors where carbon prices might go in the future. And there are some encouraging news from the countryside. For example, the Netherlands. This is not in the context of a recovery package, but of the climate agreement that the Netherlands have just agreed on last 2 years ago, I think. So what they do now, they implement an abatement payment. So they give direct support to green technologies, and at the same time, they have implemented a national carbon price trajectory that goes up to 120 euros in 25 years, I think, in 2030. So there's this direct connection between stimulus, like support to green technologies, but then with the view that the carbon price is rising over time. And we have other carbon price trajectories in place in Canada, in Germany. So this is something encouraging news from the government side as well. And I think you also asked about the prospects and the barriers, and I won't go into details. Happy to talk about this later during the discussion. But what we find here at the OECD is that carbon pricing is not currently being used to its potential. Carbon prices are currently too low to incentivize deep decarbonization for most energy users, at least. And so we at the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration, we have a long-standing tradition to track, to collect, and analyze carbon pricing trends. For more than 40 OECD and G20 economies, we look at effective tax rates on carbon emissions, and this includes looking at carbon taxes, fuel taxes, emission trading systems. And what we see, so our research shows that 79% of all energy-related carbon emissions are not taxed at a level that is compatible with the decarbonization according to the Paris Agreement. And what we find as well is that 70% of emissions are entirely untaxed. There are emission trading systems that increase the share of emissions that are priced in some countries, but still it doesn't reverse the global picture. So the question is, how can countries do better to send the right signal to business, to industry, to consumers that the future is low carbon or zero carbon, net zero carbon? As I already mentioned, the rising carbon price trajectories combined with the green stimulus will allow us to move there, to move to effective carbon pricing as the recovery strengthens, and then send the right signals to investors. And I think that's for me for the main points now. I'm happy to have questions on the challenges or any other questions. Thank you.
Brian, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
I was just introducing myself and thanking the moderators and Erica and Jeff for the invitation today, and of course the broader team at IIS. I'll speak to this a little bit in a couple of moments, but I think that this webinar comes at exactly the right time. And, you know, of course, green recovery conversations have been going on for many months now, and we've seen some degree of positive action from governments, particularly in Europe. But much of that original coverage has faded in recent months. It's important that some of the momentum begins to grow again. But briefly, an introduction on my end. I'm Brian O'Callaghan. I lead the Oxford University Economic Recovery Project. I also consult to the Energy and Environment portfolio of the Robertson Foundation, and my background is in engineering and finance, now rather ridiculously entitled as an economist. A brief note on the Oxford University Economic Recovery Project 2. This was launched back in April following a paper which helped to accelerate a lot of the initial green recovery conversation. I'm going to post it in the chat now in case others are unfamiliar with it. I worked alongside Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern, as well as Cameron Hepburn from Oxford and Dimitri Zangelis at Cambridge to think through what the economic characteristics of green spending look like. And I'd really like to spend some of my time today speaking to those economic characteristics and following from the, on the spending side, following from the great taxation side comments we've just heard. But before all of that, why do I say that this is an opportune moment for this conversation? Well, in preparing for this, I could think of at least three good reasons. First, global vaccination programs are underway, meaning that, save from new surprises with mutant strains, many high-income governments will soon be able to shift their attention from the rescue type spending that was just described to the recovery type spending that we're really all talking about. Secondly, why this is an opportune moment. Green recovery policy making in many high-income nations has shifted from discussions of economics and what may be analytically best practice to discussions of politics. You know, it's now about making reasonable trade-offs between, in some cases, good, in some cases, bad policy ideas. But with it, as with any political conversation, if we're wanting to influence outcomes, our voices now need to be louder than ever. And third, a aspect to this conversation, which I think is being overlooked in global conversations, is the importance of looking to lower income nations. The conversation in those contexts is very quickly shifting to impending debt crises and the need for dramatically accelerated global concessional finance. And there's quite a big opportunity for high income nations and major multilaterals as well, like the World Bank, to combine this concessional finance with climate priorities, right? To direct concessional finance to new climate-based investments or investments that are tied to climate outcomes in some way, whatever form that might eventually be. So those are the three key reasons I think we should be keeping in the back of our mind now for the conversation in February 2021. It's different from last year. But really today, my most crucial contribution is on what a green recovery would mean for public spending and whether current action, I suppose, matches those green aspirations. So to date, we've seen, according to our numbers, approximately 15.2 trillion in new government spending in the world's 50 largest economies. I specifically say government spending and not stimulus, as we've just heard, right? Spending consists of these rescue and recovery measures. Rescue is that which is designated to or designed to save people and businesses today. Recovery is what is used to reinvigorate economies following from the crisis. So the stimulus checks in the US, not stimulus, that's rescue. The job fellow schemes in the UK, not stimulus, that's rescue. And vaccine spending all over the world, that's not stimulus, that's rescue. And this distinction is so crucially important because when I say 15.2 trillion, only 12% of that has been spent on recovery measures. The whole rest has been spent on rescue. If you compare that 12% global average to a country like Australia, which has basically been able to eradicate the virus and seriously pursue economic recovery or restart, Australia spent about 39% of their funds on recovery, right? So there's a big gap and a long way to go. My point is we may have missed a couple of the early opportunities for green recovery, but the golden opportunity, as Alan puts it, it's still very much on the table. So why spend green? Well, you'll note further comments in that paper I shared in the chat. But basically, there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that green spending measures can match and in some cases exceed the economic characteristics of traditional alternatives. So here I'm talking about renewable energy spending versus coal spending, for example. And when I say match and exceed economic characteristics, I'm talking about short-term job creation, and I'm talking about long-term economic multipliers. And certainly our modeling suggests, subsequent to that paper posted there, our modeling and advisory in context all over the world, both lower income and higher income, suggests that is true, and happy to speak to that modeling in the questions. But beyond those economic characteristics, well-targeted spending, of course, has can have positive climate outcomes. But in addition to the economics and climate, there are a whole host of other opportunities here that we see to be co-benefits available for the taking, really. It depends basically on the policymaker's own priorities as to which is pursued. So we're talking about addressing serious and long-term social inequalities through targeting your spending on perhaps energy efficiency retrofits to lower income individuals, right? And there's a lot of work being done on these various interfaces, but topics like health through improved air quality, topics like more equal access to transport through low carbon new public transport initiatives, etc. So I'm trying to bring a lot of different concepts together in one. And of course, there's depth here, and I'm happy to speak to that depth during the questions. Quickly to finish, what have we seen so far? Well, here I'm going to introduce the Global Recovery Observatory to you, the audience, but also leave a little bit of a cliffhanger. So here at Oxford, we've launched and managed this observatory with partner support from the United Nations Environment Programme, the IMF, the UNDP, and GIZ. We also just put together a paper titled, "Are We Building Back Better?" which is to be released on March the 10th, and we're happy to circulate the details of that release, where we go into 60 pages of depth on where we have been spending green, where we have been spending dirty, where the forthcoming opportunities lie. Now, I have to give you a little bit of a taste of the outcome. The answer is we've seen some positive spending in high-income European countries. Beyond that, the picture is rather grim. We've seen in many countries more spending on even dirty recovery policies than green recovery policies. In most countries, we're talking the 95% or so of spending not having any green characteristics whatsoever. So it's not a great picture to start off with, but as Helen mentioned, the golden opportunity is big and it continues from here. That's all from me.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think we can now ask the audience to make their questions, but in the meantime, I have one for you all. So for what we're seeing so far in the US COVID stimulus, the current package, and the proposals Biden made during the campaign, do you think this is sufficient if extrapolated to the rest of the major emitters to put us on the right track? And maybe we can start with Professor Haynes. Thank you.
Well, I'm certainly no expert on the Biden package, but I think that certainly Biden has really put the US back on track in terms of its prominence on the world stage. There's a lot of interest, I know, from my US colleagues in zero carbon policies that will also improve health. So using the argument of reduced air pollution, improved food and diets, and physical exercise as well, using those as an arguments for justifying, if you like, in addition to the climate imperative, one of the arguments for justifying this investment, such as it is, in decarbonization. So I think we're in a much better space in the US, obviously, than we were just a few months ago. I suppose the question is, and I think Brian and others articulated that very clearly, is, how much will these kind of steps really influence other countries which are still largely investing in high carbon investments, which will just drive us, further away from the Paris Treaty. So I think there's a lot to aim for at the moment. I think the Biden administration is making all the right noises. How much they can deliver that, of course, will depend on how much they can get around a rather recalcitrant Senate. But I think certainly the situation is looking good. And there are some key players like Gina McCarthy, for example, someone that has a long track record of working for public health and environmental health, who is now in a key strategic position as head of the US climate change mitigation sort of strategy. So she will be very much directing that strategy with health and a green recovery in mind, but still a long way to go before, I think, implementing and achieving that success.
Thank you very much, Professor Haynes. Is anyone else on the panel that want to add anything? Maybe Ms. Clarkson?
Sure, yeah, I have a very easy answer on, if anyone ever says, is that sufficient? No, there's nothing sufficient on climate. And I think, that isn't to underestimate how big these packages are, how important they are, how, without it, they are necessary, but nothing is ever sufficient. So I think, we just have to keep in mind that even if you keep warming down to 1.5, that's to give you a better shot, right? So it's always, I always sort of worry about complacency and sort of, is this enough? Is this enough? Like, no, we've got to do everything as fast as possible, as much as possible. That said, I agree, looking at who's come into the US administration is a really, it's a good shot in the arm for the climate. We've now got to think as well, and also Xi Jinping has come back in China, who was the negotiator who took China essentially did a deal with Obama and took them both into the Paris Agreement. I think that's a really good sign. I think I don't know how much is motivated by sending that signal to the US. So you've got the US and China together. We've got to keep a really strong eye on emerging economies. When you look through the analysis of the stimulus packages, you've got countries in which those packages are either kind of locking down existing high carbon infrastructure or environmentally damaging policies, or kind of stimulating worse. So you've got Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Russia, all of those countries. So there's a lot to do and look at globally. And I think we need that leadership from the US and China, but we've got to keep a really strong eye on what's happening everywhere and keep that spirit of the Paris Agreement going.
Thank you very much. And Brian, Louisa, do you want to add anything on that, or we can go ahead with the other questions?
Maybe just to add that I think it was a really good step, like to see getting the US administration back to the Paris Agreement is already like a big announcement. And as Helen said as well, is there's momentum going on. There's China putting into place an emission trading system, and there's the Green Deal in the European Union that is currently being discussed. This means the revision of the ETS, the revision of the energy tax directive, a potential border carbon adjustment is going to be proposed potentially in June. So there's momentum, and I agree that, I mean, recovery packages are not enough to get us to Paris Agreement. We just need to make sure that they do not harm our way towards the decarbonization, I would say.
Yeah, look, the only point I have to add is when you're talking about sufficiency, there are very many different sides to that conversation, right? Is it sufficient to meet the carbon abatement needs of the world? Obviously not, and I think we've just spoken to that. Is it sufficient as a percentage of total recovery spending? That's a very different question, and one that I think we all need to question seriously ourselves, right? Because for many countries, this is a conversation about investment in healthcare versus education versus climate action. And so simply stating that everything is insufficient unless it's at 100%, I don't think is helpful into the conversation. I don't think that's what the panelists are suggesting either. But to answer that question, which is obviously a much more challenging one, as I say, is difficult. We have countries like Denmark who've spent, I think, 62% of total recovery spending on green initiatives. France is somewhere around 40%, the UK about 10%. Australia, let's talk about Australia. Australia is my home, 2%. Obviously 2% is insufficient, but is 62% insufficient? Well, I think it's a harder case to make there. What is sufficient kind of depends on what we call the absorptive capacity of the economy. You can't just put, 100 trillion into only green spending. There just aren't enough workers to make that happen. And in that case, it makes a lot of sense to spread it around a little bit. So the sufficiency conversation, I think, is quite complex when you're speaking about a recovery package.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone. And we are also two people that have raised their hands. So I'm going to give the floor to Adrian Codery.
Hi, picking up on what Brian O'Callaghan was saying, you were talking about the importance of looking to sort of lower income economies and the like. Can we achieve our goals without starting to look at some of the more systemic things which come from there? There's huge levels of corruption and political instability in a lot of these areas, and some of the effects of global warming could make this a lot worse moving forwards.
Thank you.
That's a great question. I'm not sure if you got cut off there at the end, but that's a great and difficult question. So we do quite a bit of work in various developing contexts on both modeling potential economic impacts and then the far more challenging question of mobilizing political support. Corruption is one issue to deal with in terms of both securing funds and delivering funds to the intended end destination. And it's all I can say is it's a challenge. We have to rely on local partners as opposed to multilateral institutions to really get organic movement going, because it's a imposed requirement, particularly in an African context. It's going to be very, very difficult to get any type of long-term support. There's a lot more, there has been a lot more success recently in the Latin American context. I think it's the Georgetown Declaration that was signed at the Environment Ministers Forum a couple of weeks ago. Additionally, in Southeast Asia, I also know that there's more forward momentum. You also bring up a fantastic point, which is that some of these long-term impacts are going to be most severe in lower income countries, the most vulnerable groups in those countries in particular. So there's a lot to gain by helping these nations prioritize climate goals, both for the development of those countries themselves, but also for the global order. I think we all would prefer stability in those nations, both in a humanitarian context, but then also there are economic advantages to a stable a global system and supply chains, etc. So it's a great question. Thank you for it.
Sorry, you're muted.
I was just giving you the floor. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So, well, in terms of the impacts of climate change, of course, yes, it will be felt most heavily in many low-income countries. Not to say that any part of the world, of course, will be immune to the effects of climate change. Everywhere will be affected. But yes, the impacts are almost certainly going to be greater in places like sub-Saharan Africa. You've got the challenges of extreme heat exposure, which will reduce and is already reducing labor productivity, for example, affecting agricultural yields. The challenge of communicable diseases, water-related diseases, vector-borne diseases, and so on, like dengue, and in some parts, malaria as well. And then these complex kind of emergencies, droughts, floods, other extreme events, which are going to have far-reaching implications for human health. So yes, there's, I think, very little doubt about that, unfortunately. And nevertheless, we have seen substantial advances in health in some parts of Africa. You know, you've got countries like Rwanda, for example, which made good steps forward. Other parts of Africa have also done really quite well in terms of improving human health indicators. So investment in primary healthcare, in the basic level of healthcare, is actually a very good investment. And, you know, you could, for about 5% of total current global healthcare expenditure, you could really cover the whole world with essential access to basic healthcare. And WHO estimates that would probably prevent about 60 million deaths over the next decade or so, something of that order. So that would be an extremely good investment in terms of resilience to climate change and other emergencies and infectious diseases as well. And I think there's also a lot that can be done in targeting policies like subsidy withdrawal, for example, fossil fuel subsidy withdrawal. There's some interesting examples from countries like Indonesia, where they withdrew their fossil fuel subsidies at a time when fossil fuels were fairly cheap anyway, but they redirected the subsidies into supporting universal health coverage. In that way, they reduced the political opposition to actually removing the subsidies, because people could see that they were getting a benefit, which was access to reasonable quality health care. And likewise, carbon pricing. Louisa mentioned carbon pricing. Again, that can be designed to improve health and improve equity, as long as you don't, you know, make sure that the low-income populations don't suffer adversely from carbon pricing, and use that income from carbon pricing as a way of reducing, for example, the tax burden on low-income people. So there are certainly ways of designing subsidy withdrawal and carbon pricing in ways that will maximize the benefits for health and welfare more generally. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. And before we go to Helen and Luisa, we have here another person that wants to make a question. Then maybe you can collate the two. So Yogedra Kumar, can you please make your question?
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, my question actually is that when you're talking about recovery from the COVID pandemic situation, one thing you notice actually, even the developed countries like the US or Brazil, or for that matter, other countries, the dilemma actually has been to balance between fighting the pandemic or actually making the business and the economy going. And therefore, the result of that actually that there's not enough money available, which can be given to support these kind of, the reduction of carbon emissions in the developing countries. And in fact, in that situation, in this particular case, you find that in terms of the funding support from the developed countries, developing countries actually has been absolutely dismal, really. Whereas what is required is technology which can be used in the developing countries for either, for example, clean coal technology or retrofitting of coal-fired power plants and so on and so forth. So unless this kind of money is made available, you will actually find that because of the fact that countries are now trying to actually come out of the pandemic, the economic impact of the pandemic, I think we should not be painting a rather optimistic picture as to the effect of all this, the effort to actually have green economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yogendra. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Can I ask Helen to take this one?
I think it's a really interesting point, but I think it's wrong to pin that on the pandemic. There's never been enough money for emerging economies on climate, and you're absolutely right about technology. And this has been the subject of conversation at the COPs for the last however many years, and we see it with the state and regional governments we work with. Access to finance, access to finance, access to finance. You're right. But I don't think there's a choice between we'll send us money for this or that. We've got to find a way to open up the financial markets, get investment going. And I don't think there's a reason for thinking that it's not the same issue everywhere, of that there are huge opportunities around investing in things like renewable energy, clean technologies, which are huge opportunities for jobs in different places. And what I think we have to be super careful of is sort of assuming that you've got to do the dirty development first and then switch it out later. We need to be putting money into clean technologies now, which have all these other benefits, both for the environment, specifically in places, for people's health and so on. And so we need to avoid this, let's do the dirty stuff first. And I think that has evolved a lot, and we are seeing lots of places around the world move straight to cleaner technologies, and that's what we need to continue. So I think that point about financing comes back to the kind of climate finance point, which is rightly been raised, and is a real bone of contention.
Thank you very much, Helen. And Louisa?
I can just add, Professor Haynes has already pointed out the main point from my side. Again, carbon pricing here is not only an opportunity for countries, for developing countries as well, to mobilize domestic resources. Just putting an energy tax in place, it is not that difficult administratively. We don't need to figure out a carbon tax or a highly complex emission trading system. An energy tax based on the carbon content of the fuel is implementable, will give developing countries resources to finance health, to finance public expenditures, to finance schools, and to finance also direct transfers to vulnerable households. So all this is feasible administratively. And then also, and this links back to the technology discussion, having a carbon price in place will direct the foreign direct investment towards the clean choices. If you have a signal in your country that dirty coal is not the way to go, then the FDI will not implement dirty coal. So that's just a bit easy, put it easy, but I think again, and I come back to my carbon pricing argument, it is helpful for domestic resource mobilization for developing countries, and it is good to direct your FDIs into the low carbon sectors again.
Thank you very much, Louisa. And I see that Brian is sending some data and analysis to the audience, very much appreciated. And if anyone has specific questions on what Brian is sending, please do raise your hand or send us a question in the chat box. We have a few questions. Just let me open it. There is one about the fact that you are referring to the reduction of greenhouse gases, but your focus seems to be mainly on decarbonization. And so this person is asking whether you can quantify and name the other greenhouse gases and illustrate the policy measures to reduce the non-carbon ones. If you can please answer to that, and we have a few more later.
Should I start with that one and others can chip in? So, I mean, the other greenhouse gases that are really important are methane, which is relatively short-lived. It's just over 10 years atmospheric lifetime, something of that order. And that comes from ruminant animals, so cattle, for example, particularly. Also from rice paddies, depending on how the rice paddies are cultivated, from gas leaks and other sources. It's important in as much as it's not only a greenhouse gas, but it also contributes to air pollution. So it's a precursor of something called ozone, which is a very reactive gas in the atmosphere, which damages our health, probably causes about 1 million deaths a year, something of that order, but also damages crop yield as well. So strategies to reduce the levels of methane would obviously be those that target fossil fuels, because some of it comes from fossil fuels, but also it raises the difficult issue of food systems, diet and more sustainable, healthy diets, and particularly in high-income countries where we have a high consumption of red meat and other ruminant products. To what extent is it feasible, credible, or possible to change dietary patterns? And that's a big debate right now. Diet is beginning to change spontaneously in some countries. And then there are others, we probably don't have time to go into detail, but there are the Hfcs, the hydrofluorocarbons. They're regulated through the Montreal Protocol from the Kigali Amendment, and they're used as refrigerants, so they're human produced. If the Montreal Protocol works, if the Kigali Amendment works, then it won't be so much of a problem. But if there's a lot of leakage, then it'll be a problem. And there are other short-lived gases as well, nitrous oxide. There are some of the anesthetic gases as well are climate active, and so they need to be changed. And indeed, even asthma inhalers, they include gases which are very climate active, some of these HFCs or similar kind of compounds. So we're moving towards powder inhalers rather than the old the propellant inhalers. So there's a lot that can be done, but I absolutely agree with your question. It's very important to consider all these different climate active pollutants, not just carbon dioxide, although carbon dioxide is long acting. It lasts in the atmosphere, for 100 years or more. And of course, it's the major cause of climate change.
I'll jump in here. I think that was a fantastic summary from Professor Andy. And of course, we also have nitrous oxide to add to that list. And again, on nitrous oxide, we're talking mostly about agricultural emissions. Some other ideas in terms of addressing the methane emissions, in building retrofits. There's been some work from the Rocky Mountain Institute out last year, which demonstrated the health and climate impacts of gas stove leakage and their potential to use green retrofit incentives to replace older gas stoves, basically. There are also a couple of initiatives, I think, across Canada, which have been looking to address methane leakage in gas pipelines, and that's highly labor intensive and therefore fairly good from an economic stimulus perspective. I will say that the agricultural interventions are hard to justify from an economic perspective in the short term, and we're doing some work to try to figure out how to increase the short-term economic characteristics or improve the short-term economic characteristics of those. The one exception there is efficiency measures in agriculture. And then just briefly, Nicholas, one question which you raised in the chat is also on nuclear and whether we should be talking about nuclear capacity here for a clean baseload energy. I think that this isn't really a discussion about nuclear versus renewables versus other. Personally, I'm fine with nuclear if we can do it in a safe way. But if you're talking about the economic recovery potential, nuclear plants have a ridiculously long planning timeline, and any money allocated to a nuclear plant today will probably result in boots on the ground 10 years from now. So the economic recovery characteristics aren't that strong, and that's why we haven't been focusing on it, at least. But it's a good question.
Can I
thank you so much, Brian. I know that Helen needs to go, so
I need to go in 2 minutes.
Yes.
I think that's a really good point, Brian, on the nuclear, because I get asked that a lot. But why aren't we doing that? And it's just the pragmatics of nuclear and the planning horizon, how long it takes and how quick renewables are in comparison. And I think that's it's one of those things where, again, we get into the kind of those realms of like, let's have a moral debate. It's like, let's have a pragmatic debate. What are we doing tomorrow? How quickly can we get up wind farms? How quickly can we get up solar? And that's where I think it's exciting. And that's where you come back to the kind of characteristics of carbon, that the sooner you get it, the sooner you don't admit it. It's kind of counterfactual, but every atom counts and sits in the atmosphere. And we've seen some of these other technologies just take so long, and we could have done much more in that time. So that's again, urgency, and that I'll leave that as my last word, is just urgency. But thanks very much for including me.
Thank you very much, Helen, for participating to this event. And with the others, instead we can continue a little bit longer, because there are some other questions that we can ask you to answer, because it will be very interesting to hear your view on, for example, the green recovery policies in the period 2007-2009, during the financial crisis. Now, a few years ahead of that period, how effectively you think that those policies were carried out, and which are the lessons that we can learn today from the experience of 10-12 years ago? We can start with Luisa, maybe.
Yeah, so maybe one point to reflect on this is, like, we are still talking about how should we prepare our economies to decarbonize. So this already tells us something on how effective these green policies have been in 2007 and 2009, because we are still not where we are. So I think the idea is not so much to look back and think what worked, what did not work. It's more perspective. It's like, what do we need to put in place now in this current context, and to go forward, I think.
Thank you. And if Brian and Professor Haynes have anything to add on that?
Well, just a quick word from the health perspective. I think one of the lessons from that period was that those countries which put in place more effective social, effective social networks, or social security safety nets and so on, and a better functioning universal health coverage, that the health impacts were smaller in those countries. So we didn't see some of the increase in death rates that occurred in other countries where the systems were much weaker. So it does raise that issue, in the post-COVID situation, will that be a lever for increased progress in countries like the US, for example, where extraordinarily, despite spending more per capita than anyone else on healthcare, they still don't have universal health coverage. And we can debate, there's all sorts of reasons why that's so, but will it actually put pressure on the Biden administration, or will it overcome some of the resistance from the Republican Party to universal health coverage and better social safety nets? Will it actually also be a lever towards moving towards the universal basic income, which is a very, very active debate at the moment. And it's people have different views on it, but will the COVID situation, where so many people lost their jobs, actually lead in the longer term to implementation of the whole concept of universal basic income? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's plausible. It might raise it as a policy issue.
Thank you, Professor. And
okay, I'm happy to jump in quickly. There have been a series of studies conducted following from the 2008-2009 crisis and the various spending policies that were introduced. Some of the most economically prominent are those studies relating to the ARA spending, and some comparisons between ARA spending and other approaches in various different countries, mostly Canada and Australia and China, I believe. There's a great book by Kyla Tianhara on this topic. Additionally, we've put together a database of, I think, about 100 or so literature pieces reviewing, which all speak to past green recovery initiatives, which we're using for a literature review to exactly address your question, Nicholas. What does past experience teach us, and what can we learn, and what can we therefore implement this time around? So again, stay tuned.
Thank you very much, Brian. We have a, yeah, Luisa, please go ahead.
Actually, I have a question for Brian, actually, because you talked a lot about the green spending and the expenditures here. Can you, like, I mean, I know it is super difficult to define, right, what green spending is. I mean, is a new rail track that is built, is it a green spending because you shift maybe transport from the road to green electric rail, but then it cuts through a forest? So like, how, I'm interested in how do countries compare, like how do the taxonomies across countries compare? We talk a lot about green budgeting in the OECD, the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting, where countries try to figure out like what is green and how can a country set up a green budget? But there the big issue is like what is a green investment? So can you a little bit elaborate on that? That would
yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It's a hard question and a fantastic question, and really part of the impetus for that global recovery observatory I was talking about in the beginning. The point of that observatory is to try to bring transparency to government spending. I find it ridiculous, insane, that we as taxpayers don't actually know where the government spend their money. In the US, in late December, a annual spending bill of 1,400 pages or something to that degree released with 1 week notice, 2 days notice for the full report, and somehow we're meant to interpret that and understand how governments are spending our money. We don't know. The purpose of this observatory is to track that spending and, in some ways, more importantly, assess its green, social, and economic characteristics. Now, obviously, we can't go through every individual policy and consider them all because, firstly, there's not enough information on the policy types, and second, that's just a lot of work. The observatory has about 3,500 policies in it. So what we do is we establish these spending archetypes and spending sub-archetypes. So we have 40 spending archetypes specific to contractionary fiscal expenditure, so like COVID-19 recovery expenditure, basically. 40 different archetypes covering everything. I think about 8 of them specifically talk to green initiatives, for example, clean energy spending. Within each of those archetypes, we have sub-archetypes. So within clean energy spending, we would have renewable spending, nuclear spending, hydrogen spending, about 8 or so probably per archetype, and in total then 150 sub-archetypes. So for each of those sub-archetypes then, you're already at a fairly detailed level. The insane exercise that we've been undertaking with very generous support from foundation donors and UNEP as well is to conduct literature reviews for each of those, see what little evidence there is out there to suggest what the various climate characteristics or GHG abatement characteristics might be, and then to have some type of comparative scale. So what we do is we have a score of -2 if it's a very dirty negative impact, +2 if it's a very clean impact, and then 1 and 0 in between. That's as granular as we can go, and some may argue that's probably more granular than we should go. So difficult question. We're trying our best. I'm sure that the conversation will evolve significantly over the coming few years.
I think just to mention here, I think it's the French government that came up with the first green budget, like where they really tag what is a green measure, what is a gray measure, and what is a dirty measure, which is quite interesting, I think. But I appreciate that if you look at all countries, this is going to be a quite difficult exercise. Exactly. But I think it's great to hear that there's this discussion going now within governments. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And I have another question that maybe Professor Haynes can answer first, and then also the other can give another opinion. I just wonder what you think is the current balance between investments in research and development for future decarbonization and investment in currently available green technology and using carbon pricing, other mechanisms for letting the market allocate stimulus money. I know it's not an easy question, but
yeah, it's pretty far outside my field because it might come obviously more from the health research arena rather than the kind of energy and decarbonisation research, although, there's a kind of overlap between the two agendas. So, I mean, as always, because of you could say, well, we haven't invested enough in decarbonisation research because, look where we are. We're not decarbonising quickly enough. And I think there are two different elements to that. Obviously, there's better technologies, refining those technologies. But then, of course, there's the kind of applied research, and we've been talking quite a lot about it here, which is on, physical mechanisms for rapid decarbonisation. What do we know about implementation mechanisms for decarbonisation? A project that we're involved with at the moment is called the Pathfinder Initiative, which is very much looking at the implementation end of the research agenda. So we're looking at case studies of where governments, local or national institutions, other entities have tried to implement rapid decarbonisation policies, and what impact has that actually had on the ground? Has it been implemented at the intended rate? What are the barriers and facilitators to implementation? Have they achieved the intended outcomes in terms of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and obviously we coming at it from a health perspective, so improved health or health exposures at least. So we're trying to address that gap at the kind of implementation end of the research agenda. And often in academic life, implementation research is seen as rather low prestige, not very interesting kind of work. Actually, it's very, very taxing methodologically to do it. And it's much easier to, if you've got good mathematicians, to do mathematical modeling or something like that, which probably has a much higher prestige. But implementation research is actually going to tell us what happens when the rubber hits the road, what actually happens on the ground when you try to implement rapid change. And often it's behavior change, it's human behaviors that need to change. And that's not an easy thing to do. And we have to look at both national level kind of implementation strategies like the carbon taxes, carbon pricing we've been talking about, but also smaller scale behavioral changes, nudge technologies. How do we actually move towards changing people's dietary preferences and so on? And there's a big research agenda in that, which has not been adequately funded at all. And certainly the biomedical research field, which gets billions and billions of dollars, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it almost completely overlooks the whole environmental determinants of health, which hardly receive any research funding at all. So I think there is a mismatch. Certainly in my field, there's a big mismatch, and I suspect in other fields as well.
Thank you very much, Professor. And Louisa, Brian, do you want to add anything on that before we go to the final remarks?
I actually was distracted. I didn't hear the question, so I'm fine to ask that, or you repeat the question again. Sorry for that.
Well, yeah, it was just about the correct balance between investment in research and development for future decarbonization, investment in currently available green technology, and using of pricing and mechanism for letting the market allocate stimulus money. That was
yeah, maybe then I just add, I mean, the price of course is very important, and I think I made my point, but then research and development, investing in research and development still needs to receive additional funding, because you have this market failure that you cannot, as an inventor, you just don't grasp the whole benefit that society can get. So this is the economic rationale for putting extra money into R&D. What I think is important here to mention as well is that it's not only about it's really like we need to think of the path through, like these technologies that really we need them to go to decarbonization. They are very expensive for the moment. So technology specific support has its benefits and costs, of course, but some of these technologies that we likely need to go towards decarbonization are not at a major stage for the moment. So there's need to ramp up here, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah. So broadly speaking to it, traditionally R&D investment wouldn't be characterized as the most exciting recovery type spending because the timelines are quite long. At the same time, though, in designing a recovery package, what you want is a gradual curved return to growth, not some straight line and then a drop off at some point, right? And R&D measures are one of the approaches you can use to smooth that curve because they have sort of this longer payoff. We have seen, I'm just looking to our observatory, we've seen about 19.1 billion in green R&D so far. About 10 billion or 9.7 has been in energy, 2.3 in industrial, and then the rest is sort of spread quite widely over the others. One particular area we've seen a lot of R&D investment is in hydrogen. We've seen a 5-fold increase in 2020 in annual hydrogen public spending. You can only imagine what type of impact that could have to a green hydrogen sector and the development of that sector into the future. So governments in those cases are strategically identifying potential industries that will deliver long-term growth and investing heavily into them, which I think is exactly right. That's what you do when you're at a time of economic downturn. You reflect and you set your future priorities. So yeah, we've seen some of that. I expect that we'll see a little bit more this year too.
Thank you very much, Brian, too. So I think that we are running out of time, but I wanted to take the privilege of my position and just to ask you a quick question and your closing remarks. And the question would be, what would be for you the priority for a green recovery after the COVID crisis? And maybe we can start with Professor Haynes to go around just as a small closing remarks for everybody on this. Thank you. And Professor, you are muted.
Yeah. So as you'd expect me to say, I mean, I would like to see a recovery integrating health, equity, decarbonisation alongside the economic recovery. So it seems to me that the challenge really is to kind of integrate all these key public priorities in a coherent way. And I'm afraid probably very few of the green stimulus packages actually do that. So it seems to me that that is a challenge, but we are also, dealing with the problem of not internalizing the externalities in our economic model. So it seems to me, coming at this from a public health perspective, that we have a rather dysfunctional economic model in which we don't pay the full economic cost of our activities. And that drives us in all sorts of rather, unfortunate directions, including climate change and many other threats. And until we can actually develop a much more effective way of internalizing those costs into the economy, then I fear that we're always going to be struggling and trying to catch up with packages and approaches which are only partially effective. It seems to me we need to grapple and we need to grasp that fundamental problem, which is that our economy is not designed with sustainability at its heart, unfortunately.
And that's a really fascinating thought that we hope our politicians will take into consideration in the future planning. And Luisa, do you want to add anything on that?
I guess as you can imagine, I take Eddie on the externality internalization. So let's get these carbon prices in place to make consumers, to make business, to make us all pay for the cost that we put on society by emitting carbon emissions. And I think, and as said, these price trajectories, they can help us in getting the prices in place. Maybe not at a high level now, but then with a prospect in the future to a high price. And I'm actually quite I'm optimistic as well. Like we'll see, but there's momentum during this crisis with the China, with the US, with the European Green Deal. There's some momentum. Let's see what comes out of this. I think that's a crucial year this year, and stay tuned, I think.
We like to end with this note of optimism. Thank you, Luisa, for bringing this on the table. And Brian.
I'm combining Luisa and Andy's contributions here. I actually like to talk about green recovery in the broader context of a prosperity stimulus. When governments need to be prioritizing future prosperity, not just next year's GDP. Future prosperity involves addressing systemic inequality. It involves incorporating social and health, environmental, economic outcomes into policy, right? Prosperity can be innovation, jobs, growth. It's a sustainable climate and natural landscapes. It's a world defined by true equity of opportunity, right? So if governments can just in some ways see prosperity as the end goal here, a holistic prosperity, I think a lot of these conversations would be a lot easier.
Yes, we obviously we do agree with you that keeping in mind that prosperity is and future planning can definitely help the recovery in the long term. And but we'll continue this conversation in the next months. We'll see what happens. But this event is part of a series. We want to address the climate related issues from different perspectives. We are very grateful that you have brought your perspective today. So thank you very much for participating to this event today. The next event of the series would be on environmental crime. It will take place on the 24th of March. So circulating more information about that. But today was a very interesting discussion, and I really together with Jeff and from WWS, I want to thank each of you for your excellent contributions. So thank you very much. And so I closed this event now a little bit earlier because we had plenty of time today. Usually it lasts 1 hour, that we've gone a little bit ahead of time, but so thank you very much again for participating, and we'll be in touch soon.